I always thought I knew my stepbrother. Nick was the kind of person who kept to himself, quiet, composed, the one who never let his emotions show. But that one evening, everything I believed about him and about myself turned upside down. My name is Lisa. I'm 25, and my family? Well, it's complicated. My dad remarried a few years ago, and that's how Nick became a part of my life. He's 28, a little older, always so calm and reserved, exactly the opposite of me. I'm the bubbly one, the talker, the one who always tried to break through his walls with jokes and laughter. But Nick? He was like a locked book, full of secrets no one was allowed to read. Until one evening, when I saw something I wasn't meant to see. It was late, maybe around 10 p.m. I had just finished binge-watching a show in the living room, and as I walked upstairs, I noticed a soft glow coming from Nick's room. His door was slightly open, just enough for me to see inside. I hesitated. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice. Nick deserved his privacy, and we weren't the kind of siblings who barged into each other's spaces. But something felt off. I can't explain it, but there was a strange pull, like my instincts were telling me to take a look. And that's when I saw him. Nick was sitting on his bed, his back turned to me. The dim light from his laptop screen cast shadows across the room. At first, I thought he was just scrolling through something online. But then I noticed his hand. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just browsing the internet, he was doing something far more personal, far more intimate. And then, I saw the screen. It was a photo of me. One I had posted on Instagram a few weeks ago, nothing scandalous, just me in a sundress, laughing at something off camera. But seeing it there, in this context, made my stomach churn. My mind raced with a million thoughts. Why would he have that picture open? Why is he doing this? What does this mean? I froze. My feet were glued to the floor, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. A part of me wanted to run, to pretend I hadn't seen anything, but another part, one I didn't even want to admit existed, couldn't look away. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, horrifying but impossible to stop. And then he turned. Our eyes met for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a second. His face was a mix of shock, embarrassment, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Without thinking, I turned and bolted down the hallway, slamming my bedroom door behind me. For the rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that moment replaying in my head. Nick, sitting there, the photo of me on his screen, the look on his face when he realized I was watching. My thoughts were a chaotic mess. Did I misinterpret what I saw? Was it even about me? Am I reading too much into this? But deep down, I knew the truth. The next morning, I avoided him. I stayed in my room as long as I could, pretending to be busy with work. But eventually, I had to come out for breakfast. When I walked into the kitchen, he was there, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee. He looked up when I entered, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. I quickly looked away, focusing on pouring myself a cup of tea. "Morning," he said, his voice unusually soft. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone as casual as I could manage. The tension in the room was suffocating. Neither of us said anything for a while, the silence broken only by the clinking of my spoon against the mug. I could feel his eyes on me, but I didn't dare look at him. Finally, he spoke. "About last night," he began, his voice hesitant. I froze, my hand hovering over the sugar jar. "Let's not talk about it," I said quickly, cutting him off. "But..." I said no, I snapped, turning to glare at him. His expression was hard to read, a mix of guilt and something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Fine," he said after a moment, leaning back in his chair. "If that's what you want." But the way he said it, the way his eyes lingered on me, sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And a part of me, the part one didn't want to admit even existed, wasn't entirely sure I wanted it to be. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a story I would never forget. And what happened next? Let's just say, things only got more complicated. The morning after that shocking moment, I tried to go about my day as if nothing had happened. I told myself to forget it, to move on, to pretend I hadn't seen what I saw. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Nick in his room, his face when he turned and saw me, flashed in my mind. I avoided him at every opportunity. If I heard him coming down the hall, I'd duck into another room. If I thought he might be in the kitchen, I'd wait until I was sure he was gone. But no matter how much I tried to distance myself, I couldn't escape the questions swirling in my head. Why did he have that photo of me? Was it really just a coincidence, or was there something more? By the end of the second day, my curiosity had started to outweigh my discomfort. I found myself watching him when I thought he wasn't looking, trying to piece together clues from his behavior. But Nick was impossible to read. He went about his day as if nothing had happened, calm and collected, which only made me more uneasy. That evening, I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when Nick walked in. My stomach tightened as he sat down on the other end of the couch, his presence filling the room in a way that felt overwhelming. "Hey," he said, his tone casual, but there was something in his voice that made my heart race. "Hi," I replied, not looking up from my phone. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched on, heavy and awkward. Finally, Nick broke it. "About the other night," he began, his voice calm but deliberate. I froze, my fingers hovering over the screen. "What about it?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent. "I know you saw," he said bluntly. My cheeks flushed, and I felt a surge of panic. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said quickly, hoping to end the conversation before it started. "Lisa," he said, his tone soft but firm. "You don't have to pretend. I'm not mad or anything. I think we should talk about it." "There's nothing to talk about," I said, finally looking up at him. "It was a mistake. Let's just forget it ever happened." But Nick didn't look away. His eyes stayed locked on mine, his expression unreadable. "It doesn't have to be weird," he said after a moment. I laughed, a short, nervous sound. "How could it not be weird?" "It's only weird if we make it weird," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Look, I know it probably shocked you, and I'm sorry for that. But it doesn't have to stay that way." His words hung in the air between us, and I didn't know how to respond. My mind was racing, a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't untangle. Anger, confusion, guilt, and something else. Something I didn't want to admit. "Nick, this is ridiculous," I said finally, shaking my head. "You can't just act like this is normal." "Why not?" he asked, his voice calm but insistent. "Who's to say what's normal?" "Everyone," I shot back. "Literally everyone." He smiled then, a small, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "I don't think that's true," he said. "And I think, deep down, you know it too." I stood up abruptly, needing to put distance between us. "I don't know what game you're playing, Nick, but I'm not interested." "Are you sure about that?" he asked, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving mine. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong, to storm out of the room and slam the door behind me. But I didn't. Because somewhere, in the back of my mind, a small, traitorous voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was right. The next day, I tried to focus on anything but Nick. I cleaned the house, ran errands, even started a new book, but nothing worked. No matter what I did, my thoughts kept drifting back to our conversation. His words replayed in my head on a loop, and the worst part was, they didn't feel as ridiculous as they should have. That evening, I found myself in the kitchen, making dinner. Nick walked in, and my heart sank. I had been hoping to avoid him, but now there was no escape. Need help? He asked, his tone casual. No, I said quickly, focusing on chopping vegetables. He didn't leave. Instead, he walked over to the counter and leaned against it, watching me. You've been avoiding me, he said. I haven't, I replied, not looking up. You have, he said, his voice soft. But it's okay. I get it. You're confused. I set the knife down and turned to face him, anger flaring in my chest. Confused about what, Nick? About what you want, he said simply. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. You're unbelievable, I said finally, my voice shaking. Maybe, he said, stepping closer. But that doesn't mean I'm wrong. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he spoke again. If you want to, he said, his voice low and steady, we can do it. Together. And it doesn't have to go beyond us. It'll just be our secret. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I stared at him, my mind a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't untangle. Part of me wanted to slap him, to scream at him for even suggesting such a thing. But another part, the part one didn't want to acknowledge, wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. I turned and walked out of the kitchen without saying another word, my thoughts racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And a part of me wasn't sure I wanted it to be. As the days passed, the tension between Nick and me didn't fade, it grew. Despite my best efforts to maintain distance, I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't explain, or maybe didn't want to admit. His presence was magnetic, and every word, every glance felt heavy with unspoken meaning. Nick, however, didn't seem to struggle with the same inner conflict. If anything, he leaned into the tension, letting it shape his every action. One afternoon, I was in the living room, struggling to assemble a bookshelf I had impulsively ordered online. The instructions were a nightmare, and after 20 minutes of fumbling with screws and panels, I was ready to give up. Need a hand? Nick's voice startled me. I looked up to find him standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and a slight smile playing on his lips. No, I've got it, I said quickly, though the pile of mismatched parts told a different story. He didn't listen. Without waiting for permission, he walked over and crouched beside me. His proximity made my pulse quicken, but I tried to focus on the task at hand. Here, he said, picking up one of the panels. You're putting it upside down. I flushed, embarrassed. I was just testing it. He chuckled, the sound low and warm. Sure you were. For the next 30 minutes, we worked side by side, assembling the bookshelf in near silence. But it wasn't an ordinary silence, it was charged, every accidental touch of our hands, every brief glance, adding to the tension. When we finally finished, he leaned back and admired our work. Not bad, he said, his tone casual. But when he looked at me, there was nothing casual about his gaze. Thanks for the help, I said, standing up and brushing off my jeans. Anytime, he replied. As I turned to leave, he added, you're fun to work with, you know. Makes me want to do this more often. His words lingered in my mind long after I left the room. Later that evening, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Nick appeared again. This time, he didn't say anything, he just leaned against the counter, watching me. Can I help you? I asked, glancing at him over my shoulder. Nope, he said, smirking. I'm just enjoying the view. I rolled my eyes, but my heart skipped a beat. Very funny. I'm serious, he said, his tone softening. You're beautiful when you're focused. I froze, unsure of how to respond. His compliment felt genuine, almost too genuine. Nick, stop, I said finally, trying to sound firm. Stop what? He asked, his expression innocent but his eyes anything but. You know what? I replied, turning back to the cutting board. He didn't say anything else, but the air between us felt heavy, like something was waiting to happen. Over the next few days, Nick's behavior became bolder. He found excuses to be around me, helping with chores, offering to run errands together, even sitting beside me on the couch during movie nights. Each interaction felt like a game, one where the rules were unwritten but understood by both of us. One afternoon, he caught me in the hallway as I was carrying a load of laundry to my room. "Let me take that," he said, reaching for the basket. "I can handle it," I said, holding it tighter. "Lisa," he said, his voice low and steady. "Let me help." Reluctantly, I handed it over, and he followed me to my room. Once inside, he set the basket on the bed and leaned against the doorframe, watching me as I started folding the clothes. "You're too independent for your own good," he said, his tone teasing. "And you're too nosy," I shot back, though I couldn't help but smile. He laughed softly, his gaze never leaving me. "I can't help it. You're interesting." I paused, my hands hovering over a folded shirt. "Nick, what are you doing?" "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice light but his eyes serious. "This," I said, gesturing between us. "Whatever game you're playing, it needs to stop." He stepped closer, his expression softening. "It's not a game, Lisa." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "What's that?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "Something for you," he said, holding it out. I hesitated before taking it, my fingers trembling as I opened the lid. Inside was a delicate bracelet, simple yet elegant. "Nick, I can't accept this," I said, shaking my head. "Yes, you can," he replied, his voice firm. "It's just a gift." "Why?" I asked, looking up at him. "Because it reminds me of you," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "Every time I look at it, I think of you." His words left me speechless. I stared at the bracelet, my heart racing. Part of me wanted to throw it back at him, to tell him this was crossing a line. But another part, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, was touched, even flattered. As I looked up at him, I realized this wasn't just a game to him. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't to me either. That evening, the house felt eerily quiet. My dad and stepmom had gone out for the night, leaving just Nick and me behind. I told myself it would be fine, that I'd stay in my room, keep my distance, and avoid any awkwardness. But as the hours dragged on, I found myself wandering downstairs, unable to shake the pull that had been building between us. Nick was in the living room, sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I walked in, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Couldn't stay away," he teased. "I just needed a drink," I replied, brushing past him and heading to the kitchen. My voice sounded casual, but my heart was racing. As I poured myself a glass of water, I could feel his presence behind me before I even turned around. When I finally did, he was leaning against the doorframe, watching me with an expression that made my stomach flip. "Lisa," he said softly. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. I should have backed away, should have said something to stop him, but I didn't. I just stood there, frozen, as he reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from my face. "You don't have to pretend," he said, his voice low and steady. "Not with me." "I'm not pretending," I replied, though even I didn't believe my words. He smiled then, a small, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "You are," he said. "But it's okay. I get it." Before I could respond, he reached for my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact was electric, sending a jolt through my entire body. I should have pulled away, but instead, I let him hold it. I hated how much I liked the warmth of his touch, how right it felt despite everything. "Nick, this is wrong," I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" he asked, stepping closer. His eyes locked onto mine, intense and unrelenting. "Or is it just different?" "It's both," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't entirely true. For a moment, we just stood there, the space between us shrinking with every passing second. The air felt heavy, charged with something I didn't want to name. I knew I should step back, break the moment before it went too far, but I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the ground, and my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "You feel it too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nick," I began, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. "You don't have to fight it," he said, his gaze never leaving mine. "I know you want this. You can't deny it." "I'm not like you," I said, shaking my head. "I can't just act on feelings like this." "Why not?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Who says we can't? We're adults, Lisa. We get to make our own rules." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. Because deep down, a part of me agreed with him. A part of me wanted to throw caution to the wind and give in to whatever this was between us. Before I could talk myself out of it, he took another step closer, his face just inches from mine. I could feel his breath on my skin, warm and steady, and it made my knees feel weak. "Tell me you don't want this," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Look me in the eyes and tell me you don't feel the same way." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I couldn't do it. I couldn't lie to him, or to myself. He took that as his answer. Slowly, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a way that was both tentative and deliberate. I should have stopped him, should have pulled away, but instead, I found myself leaning into the kiss, letting myself get lost in the moment. When he finally pulled back, his eyes searched mine, looking for any sign of regret. But there wasn't any. Not yet, anyway. "You want this just as much as I do," he said softly, his voice filled with certainty. "And that's okay." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, and I didn't trust myself to say the right thing. Instead, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, my thoughts racing. What had I just done? What was I doing? And why, despite everything, did it feel so right? That evening, the silence in the house was almost deafening. My dad and stepmom had gone out for the night again, leaving Nick and me alone. I'd told myself to stay in my room, to avoid him at all costs, but as the hours dragged on, my resolve wavered. The tension that had been building between us over the past days was like an invisible thread, pulling me toward him whether I wanted it or not. I found him in the living room, sitting on the couch with the TV on, though he didn't seem to be paying attention to it. When he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, his lips curved into that small, knowing smile that always made my stomach flip. "Couldn't resist, huh?" he teased, his tone light but his eyes serious. "I was just getting water," I said quickly, though even I didn't believe my excuse. "Sure you were," he replied, his smile widening slightly. "Come sit with me." I hesitated, every rational part of me screaming to walk away. But instead, I found myself crossing the room and sitting down on the other end of the couch. The space between us felt both too small and too large at the same time. We sat in silence for a few moments, the sound of the TV filling the room. I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting, but I didn't dare look at him. My hands fidgeted in my lap, my mind racing with all the reasons why I shouldn't be here, why I should leave. But my body refused to move. "You've been thinking about it, haven't you?" he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "Thinking about what?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "About us," he said, leaning slightly closer. "About what this could be." "There is no us," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "This isn't, we can't." "Why not?" he asked, cutting me off. His tone wasn't harsh or impatient, it was calm, steady, like he had all the time in the world. "Why are you so afraid to admit what you want?" "Because it's wrong, Nick," I said, finally looking at him. "This is wrong." Does it feel wrong? He asked, his gaze piercing. When we're together, when we talk, when we're in the same room, does it feel wrong to you? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because the truth was, it didn't. It felt complicated, overwhelming, terrifying, but it didn't feel wrong. He took my silence as his answer. Lisa, he said softly, reaching out to take my hand. His touch was warm, gentle, and it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. You don't have to fight this. I do, I whispered, though even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. No, you don't, he said, his voice firm but kind. You can let go. Just for tonight. Just for us. His words hung in the air, heavy and charged. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it, and my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I wanted to run, to hide, to pretend this wasn't happening. But at the same time, I wanted to stay, to see where this would go, to give in to the pull that had been building between us for weeks. Before I could think too hard about it, he leaned in, his face just inches from mine. I could feel his breath on my skin, warm and steady, and it made my knees feel weak. Tell me you don't want this, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me, and I'll stop. I opened my mouth to say the words, to tell him to stop, but no sound came out. Because I couldn't say it. I couldn't lie. That was all the encouragement he needed. What happened next was a blur, a mix of emotions, sensations, and a complete loss of control. For a brief, intoxicating moment, I let myself get swept away in it, letting go of all the guilt, all the doubts, all the reasons why this was a mistake. But the moment it was over, reality came crashing back in. I pulled away from him, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. What have I done? I whispered, my voice barely audible. How could I let this happen? Lisa, he began, reaching for me. No, I said, shaking my head and standing up. This was a mistake. A huge mistake. It wasn't a mistake, he said, his voice calm and certain. You know it wasn't. But I couldn't listen to him. I couldn't let myself believe him. I turned and walked out of the room, my thoughts racing, my chest tight with a mixture of guilt, shame, and something I couldn't quite name. When I got to my bedroom, I closed the door behind me and sank to the floor, burying my face in my hands. My mind replayed everything that had just happened, over and over again, each time making the weight of my actions feel heavier. What have I done? I whispered to myself, tears streaming down my face. Why did I let this happen? I hated myself in that moment. Hated my weakness, my inability to say no, my willingness to throw away everything for, what? A fleeting moment of connection? A spark of something I couldn't even define? As I sat there, the reality of what I had done began to sink in. There was no undoing this. No going back. And no matter how much I wanted to pretend otherwise, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, I woke up with a weight on my chest that felt unbearable. The events of the previous night replayed in my head like a nightmare I couldn't escape. I had crossed a line, one I never thought I'd even approach, and now there was no going back. Nick didn't make it any easier. He was waiting for me in the kitchen, leaning casually against the counter as if nothing had changed. When I walked in, his face lit up with that same confident smile that now made my stomach twist in ways I couldn't untangle. Morning, he said, his tone light, almost teasing. I didn't respond. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee, keeping my back to him. My hands were trembling, and I prayed he wouldn't notice. We should talk about last night, he said, his voice steady. There's nothing to talk about, I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. It was a mistake. A huge mistake. Lisa, he said, his tone softening. You don't really believe that. I spun around, glaring at him. I do, Nick. It was wrong. All of this is wrong. Why? He asked, stepping closer. Because someone else says it is? Because you think you're supposed to feel guilty? Because I do feel guilty, I shot back. I feel disgusting, Nick. I feel like I've ruined everything. You haven't ruined anything, he said, his voice calm but insistent. We haven't ruined anything. We're not breaking anyone's rules except the ones other people made for us. Stop, I said, holding up a hand. You need to stop justifying this. We can't do this again. It's over. It's not over, he said firmly. You can tell yourself that all you want, but we both know it's not true. You felt it just as much as I did. You still feel it. Nick. We're made for each other, Lisa, he interrupted, his voice dropping to a softer, more intimate tone. You know it. I know it. Why fight something that feels this, right? His words sent a shiver down my spine, and for a moment, I hated him for knowing exactly what to say to make me question everything. But then I hated myself even more for not being able to shut him out. Over the next few days, I tried everything to create distance between us. I avoided him whenever possible, buried myself in work, even started going for long walks just to clear my head. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape him or my own thoughts. Nick didn't let up. He found excuses to talk to me, to be near me, to remind me of what had happened between us. Every time I saw him, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't handle: desire, anger, guilt, confusion. I wanted to hate him, to blame him for everything, but the truth was, I couldn't. Because a part of me still wanted him, no matter how much I tried to deny it. The breaking point came one evening when we were alone in the living room. I was flipping through channels, trying to focus on anything but the tension in the air, when he sat down beside me. You can't avoid me forever, he said, his voice low. I'm not avoiding you, I lied, not looking at him. Yes, you are, he said, his tone calm but insistent. And it's not going to work. You can't run away from this, Lisa. You can't run away from me. I turned to him then, my frustration boiling over. What do you want from me, Nick? What do you want me to say? I want you to admit the truth, he said, leaning closer. I want you to stop pretending that you don't feel the same way I do. I can't, I said, my voice breaking. I can't do this, Nick. It's tearing me apart. Then stop fighting it, he said softly. Stop making it harder than it has to be. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding. I need to go, I said, grabbing my things and heading for the stairs. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. That no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't outrun what was happening between us. The real shock came the next day. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after breakfast, when I overheard my stepmom talking to my dad in the next room. Have you noticed how strange Lisa and Nick have been acting lately? She asked, her voice low but serious. My heart stopped. I froze, straining to hear the rest of the conversation. What do you mean? My dad replied, his tone casual. I don't know, she said slowly. It's just the way they look at each other sometimes. It's like there's something going on that they're not telling us. You're imagining things, my dad said with a chuckle. They're fine. Maybe, she said, though her voice didn't sound convinced. But I think we should keep an eye on them, just in case. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. She knew, maybe not everything, but enough to suspect. If she started digging deeper, it was only a matter of time before she uncovered the truth. Panic set in as I realized how fragile everything had become. Not only was I fighting my own guilt and confusion, but now I had to worry about someone else discovering what I'd done. The walls were closing in, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold them up. I couldn't keep living like this. The guilt was eating me alive, and now that my stepmom had started to suspect something, the walls felt like they were closing in. Every time I looked at my dad, I felt a knot in my stomach. He didn't deserve this. None of this was fair to him. That night, I made a decision. It was the hardest decision of my life, but I knew it was the only way to make things right, or at least try. I needed to tell him the truth. He was in his study, going over some paperwork, when I walked in. My hands were shaking, and my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. "Hey, Lisa," he said, looking up with a warm smile. "What's up?" I swallowed hard, trying to find the words. "Dad, I need to talk to you. It's important." His smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. He set his papers aside and gestured for me to sit down. "What is it?" I couldn't meet his eyes. My hands twisted in my lap as I tried to figure out how to start. Finally, I just blurted it out. "It's about Nick," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What about Nick?" he asked, his brow furrowing. I took a deep breath and told him everything. Every detail, every mistake, every moment of weakness. My voice cracked as I spoke, and tears streamed down my face, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. When I finally finished, I looked up to see his face, a mix of disbelief, anger, and pain. "Lisa," he said slowly, his voice shaking. "Tell me you're joking." "I'm not," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I didn't mean for this to happen. I don't even know how it happened." He stood up abruptly, pacing the room, his hands running through his hair. "How could you do this?" he demanded. "How could either of you do this?" "I don't know," I said, sobbing. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You've destroyed this family," he said, his voice rising. "You've destroyed everything." Before I could respond, he stormed out of the room. I sat there, frozen, as I heard him shouting for Nick. My heart sank as I realized what was about to happen. The next thing I knew, the whole house was filled with their voices. My dad was yelling, demanding answers, while Nick tried to stay calm, though I could hear the edge in his voice. It didn't last long. Within minutes, my dad told him to pack his things and leave. I stayed in my room, unable to face either of them. I heard the sound of a suitcase being dragged down the stairs, the front door slamming, and then silence. The house felt emptier than ever. My dad wouldn't even look at me. My stepmom tried to comfort him, but I could tell she was just as hurt. And me? I was a wreck. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop replaying everything in my mind. I had ruined everything. My family, my relationship with my dad, even my sense of who I was. All for what? A fleeting moment of connection? A mistake that could never be undone? Sitting alone in my room, I stared out the window, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I whispered to myself, I wanted to take it all back. But now, it's too late. I've destroyed everything I loved. And that's the truth. That's where my story ends. But I have to ask, if you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have stopped it before it went too far? Or would you have made the same mistakes I did? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts.